Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Academic Half Day, the last one of the 2019 year. I hope everyone in the room has taken some time to do some introductions and also with the folks on WebEx as well. My name is Sunil Bapat. I'm a fifth year resident, and my topic today is health hazard assessment. So I'd like to make some acknowledgement before I begin my presentation. My slides are adapted from Dr. Niels Konecki, who is an occupational medicine physician here at the University of Saskatchewan, and also from Dr. Ray Copes, who's an environmental public health physician at Public Health Ontario. So, the Royal College Objectives of Training for Public Health and Preventive Medicine state that 5.1.1 identify known or potential health effects associated with a particular hazard relevant to health protection in a population, drawing on expertise as appropriate. And a subcategory for that is to categorize the hazard identified both quantitatively and qualitatively. And the next subcategory is assess the degree of risk associated with exposure to a hazard found in a population. And then the next category is also integrate hazard identification, characterization, and assessment into an estimate of the adverse events likely to occur in a population based on a hazard found in that population. So an outline for today's presentation. First, we'll go over some basic concepts and examples. Then we'll talk about hazards, and then we'll get into risk assessment and the four-step process there, with hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, risk characterization, and then we'll talk about control models. So some learning objectives for today: characterize hazard quantitatively and qualitatively, assess the degree of risk associated with exposure to a hazard found in a population, and to integrate all of the concepts today in case studies. So as we get actually now we're in this environmental public health block of our academic half day. The lectures that will be coming after my presentation in January and February will kind of build on information today, and even then a lot of topics may be covered in other sections like toxicology, or there's a risk management and risk management, risk communication lectures in the new year. So some of the topics might cross over here. So let's start off with this scenario. You're an associate medical officer of health at a public health unit in a small community. You're notified about an oil spill after a train derailment. A number of rail cars are discharging crude oil into a lake that serves as a community water supply. So what do you do? I'll hope to come back to this scenario at the end of the presentation. So hopefully after today's PowerPoint, we'll be able to answer this at the end of the presentation. So let's start off with some definitions. Can anyone, or does anyone have a way of identifying what is a hazard, or actually can anyone define a hazard, and then can anyone define risk? So I hope the seniors have some sort of clear definitions in their mind, but for everyone else, we'll start off with the elementary kind of way of organizing your thoughts here. So hazard, can a substance or circumstance cause harm? And then risk, will a substance or circumstance cause harm? So you can kind of classify it these ways, and it might help in later on as we move through these slides. So first things first, before controlling a hazard, first have to identify and recognize the hazard. And secondly, then we have to assess the risk. So if there's sufficient risk to warranting controlling the hazard, then we have to do so. So identifying and recognizing a hazard. So, based on this picture, you can see that it's quite problematic here. You can see there's a table with a cinder block on it, and then a ladder attached, or not attached, but on top of the cinder block. And then I'm not sure where this part of the ladder is attached to, on top of like the electric circuit or just beside it. So obviously numerous risks. So how, and in this picture for this person who's maybe putting up Christmas lights or doing some shingling or roofing kind of work. So assessing risk can be a simple process. It's a decision made on the spot that a risk exists and controls are needed. Assessing risk can also be an involved process. It can involve research, measurements, analysis, and other ways of assessing risk. And then there can also be something in between the two as well. So how do you decide what is risky and what isn't? And what factors influence that decision? Assessing risks can be a simple process, decision made on the spot that risk exists and controls are needed. Sorry, I think I'm saying the same slide. I went back. But what I'm trying to say though is that there is a complicated, or not a complicated, but a simple method of distinguishing these two that I hope to achieve in the next few slides, that we can be able to distinguish the two. So you can see in this factory there's a number of workers who are working in a foundry, and they're worried about inhaling their fumes when working near some molten metal. So, what kind of measures or control things would you be thinking about here? So some ways to reduce their exposure would be to provide them with a properly fitted mask, a well-functioning respirator. We can shorten the time that they work near the fumes. We can use some ventilations to draw the fumes away from their breathing zone. And we can also teach the workers about the hazards of breathing molten metal fumes, and let them decide how to best protect themselves. So maybe this picture is not that great, but you can see a few of the workers don't even have a mask over them. I'm not sure about this person either. So when we talk about control measures towards the second half of this presentation, then maybe this picture might help in explaining some of those things when we talk about control measures. So, as I've said, once a workplace or an environmental hazard is identified and a risk is present, how do you control that exposure to the hazard? And we'll talk about that in the second half of the presentation. So let's start talking about health hazards. And there's 5 major categories. There's physical, chemical and particulate, biological, ergonomic, and psychological. So with physical hazards, we're talking about those that represent sources of energy and those that can cause injury or illness. So noise, radiation, vibration, temperature, pressure, other sources of energy that can cause injury, kinetic, gravitational, electrical, etc. So somebody working at in the airport, on the runways, some of those workers exposed to numerous kind of physical exposures, such as noise, vibration, temperature. This person seems to be dressed up for winter weather, and a lot of occupational kind of hazards, more of the workforce. So I don't want to get into too much of the workforce type of things, but this is just one example. And back to that example that we talked about with the molten fumes. And then here's another one with a worker, and he's got a kind of one of those rigs that he's drilling into So the vibration of that would have some exposure. So the next hazard is chemicals and particulate. So these would include things like dust and mists, gases, vapors, irritants, corrosive. They can be solid, liquids, or gases. Other things could be acids, bases, solvents, lubricants, cleaners, oils, etc. Biological hazards can include bacteria, fungi, viruses, organic dusts, allergens. Ergonomic hazards could be biomechanical, repetitive motion, static postures, forceful and prolonged exertions, and also like workplace design. And then psychological, these would include stress, demands versus control, harassment, abuse, conflict, shift work. So these are um, things under psychological. So the Canadian Safety Association has a standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace, and they have a kind of a good, nice manual for the prevention, promotion, and guidance to stage implementation in the workplace for health and safety. And then here's another diagram that's quite popular for psychological demands and um, decision and latitude control. So you can see um, uh, in the this corner for somebody with high psychological demands, but low decision making, low decision has a risk of psychological strain and physical illness, versus somebody with high psychological demands and high decision control, has learning motivation to develop new behavioral patterns. Um, Down here would be low strain, so low psychological demands, and high decision latitude, and then passive down here. So these are the 5 health hazards. So I'm going to break this presentation up into chunks to give myself a break also with doing this webinar, and also for ease of uploading smaller files, video files to the YouTube link. So I will stop right here and then start back up in the next video.